You ever wondered what you are voting for? Do you get confused when a no means support, a yes vote means opposed? If knowledge is power, we should learn as much as we can before filling out those all important bubbles. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Proposition 101 Forum, hosted by the San Diego Graduate Chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. My name is Cassandra Clady. I am the Connection Political Chair for the sorority. And as you know, this is a very critical election with very important ballot measures. This guest speaker we have today is Jason Berkovich. He is the Director of Constituent Services for Congressman Scott Peters' office. Jason was born in Madison, Wisconsin, and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He graduated from University of California, Riverside with a BA in business economics and a minor in political science. As I mentioned, he is the Director of Constituent Services for Congressman Scott Peters' office. He's been there since 2013, specializing in immigration, foreign affairs, and financial services. In addition, his work in politics in addition to working in politics, he was also a financial advisor for 10 years. It's an interesting dynamic with various institutions throughout San Diego County. Jason is actively involved in the Jewish community, serving on the board of the San Diego Regional Board for the ADL and on the Jewish Family Services Public Affairs Committee since 2014. Jason resides in San Carlos neighborhood with his beautiful wife and 2 children. At this time, I would just like to go over the brief format of 4 questions. Jason will present each proposition and allow three to 4 questions at the end of each proposition, with the exception of some other propositions that are a little bit more complex. We request that any questions that you have, please put it in the chat box. If you have some technical issues, you may raise your hand. And Tasia Gaston, if you could raise your hand, Tasia, she will look at the chat and basically assist Jason with the questions. So we request you put them in the chat box. If you're having some technical issues, you can just always raise your hand. Okay. So at this time, I would just like to turn it over to our speaker for today, Jason.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. Thanks for having me. It's really it's a pleasure and an honor. Something that I forgot on my bio that I think is pertinent. I'm in Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity, so I always appreciate seeing other members of the Greek community getting involved and getting informed, because I know it played a very big role in where I am today. I mean, learning about politics and the importance of that from being involved in Interfraternity Council and other Greek organizations on campus. So with that, the presentation today, first of all, a couple things of note. It is an entirely bipartisan presentation. Some would say nonpartisan. I will essentially walk through, if you vote yes on a proposition, what does that mean? If you vote no, what is that going to mean? We're going to look at some of who the key elected officials, how they stand, whether they support, whether they oppose. And then you'll also notice on some of the proposition, there's a dollar amount. Many people like to say follow the money. So I'll give you some background on how much money is being spent either for or against any of these measures. And then, as was mentioned as well, we will pause in order for people to have those questions. But please remember to enter the questions into the chat for Tasia to help me out, because it gets a little complicated to keep track of the PowerPoint while looking at the chat as well. So that allows me to focus a little bit on my notes. And with that, let me go ahead and share the presentation and get us going. And by the way, if I'm speaking a little bit too quickly, feel free to yell at me. I work for a congressman, so I won't be offended. I've already heard it all. And here we go. So we'll take these in order just to make it easier. And like I said, we will stop for questions. So one other note before I get into Proposition 14, there are 12 statewide propositions. And an important thing to note is anything that's called a proposition is the entire state of California, and it has a number. If you hear people speaking about ballot measures, those are local and they have letters. So that's a key distinction as you go through your ballot. When you see proposition or numbers, everyone in California is voting on that. If you see measure and a letter, it can either be the county, the city, the school, but those are localized. So that's an important way to keep track of who's voting on what, is whether it has a number or a letter attached to it. There are 12 statewide propositions in November that everybody in California is going to be voting on. So we'll start with those, and then time permitting, I'll discuss some of the local stuff as well. So Proposition 14. Proposition 14 is a bond measure. So in the state of California, the state is not allowed to borrow any money without permission from the voters. So Proposition 14 is the state asking us permission to borrow money. And what are they trying to borrow money for? Well, a yes allows the state to issue $5.5 billion worth of bonds in order to fund stem cell research grants. So a yes, and this one's pretty straightforward. Yes is to allow the state to issue $5.5 billion in bonds to fund stem cell research grants. A no would not allow the state to issue those bonds. A couple of other notes on the bonds and on what they'd be used for. So the cost of the bond, because we are borrowing, so to issue the $5.5 billion, it would cost the state $7.8 billion to pay it back, and that is specifically laid out. So we'd borrow the $5.5 billion, and then the state would have to pay back $7.8 billion over the course of 30 years. Who is eligible for the money? Well, educational, nonprofit, and private entities could all apply for this money, and it goes towards stem cell research, as I mentioned, but it can also go towards therapy development and a little bit towards facility construction. A key thing to note of the $5.5 billion, 92.5% of it is restricted to research and therapy development. Again, 92.5% is restricted to research and therapy development. Another $1.5 billion out of the $5.5 billion is specifically for central nervous system disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, and things like that. One other thing of note on this one is this proposition is a continuation of a proposition that we passed in 2014. In 2014, we authorized $3 billion to use for this same purpose. But that $3 billion is almost out. So that's why they're asking more money to replenish the program. Who supports this funding? The California Democratic Party supports it. The UC Board of Regents and local Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher are the primary supporters. The supporters are spending $9.3 million on this proposition. Opposed are the California Republican Party and the Center for Genetics and Society. The main arguments that you run into on Proposition 14, the yes say that stem cell research is critical because it helps with some of these diseases which are quite troubling. For example, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. So this money really helps us to find ways to cure those. The opponents of this primarily land in two buckets. You have fiscal conservatives that don't like the state to borrow money. That's the primary argument from the Republican Party. There's fiscal concerns. And then the other concern, and this is part of the Center for Genetics and Society, there's concerns about oversight. So the $5.5 billion with grants, those grants are approved by an independent committee. Some of the opponents of this would prefer for the money to be allocated by elected officials. They would argue that the committee lacks oversight since they're not accountable to the voters. And with that, I will pause and turn it over to Tessia to see if there are any questions in the chat box.
No questions at this time.
All righty. And this one is pretty straightforward. It's basically yes supports the bonds, no opposes the bonds. With that, we will move to our next one, which is one of our complicated ones. Proposition 15. So Proposition 15 would change the property tax rules in the state of California based on how they apply to commercial and industrial property. A yes on Proposition 15 means that commercial and industrial properties would be assessed and would have to pay property taxes based on the current value of those properties. So a yes means that commercial and industrial properties would pay property taxes based on the current assessed value of their properties. No on Proposition 15 would leave in place protections and limitations from Prop 13, which was passed back in 1978. So what are the limitations from Prop 13? The Prop 13 limitations say that once you purchase a home, your property taxes on that home cannot go up by more than 2% from 1 year to the next, as long as the property, sorry, not a home, but once you purchase a property taxes on that property can't go up by more than 2% from 1 year to the next until ownership in that property changes. So as long as the same entity or individual owns a property, they're limited to that 2% increase from 1 year to the next unless they sell the property. Now in California, we've seen that property values can fluctuate quite significantly from 1 year to the next. So what happens with those Prop 13 protections is regardless of how the value of your property is fluctuating, that 2% cap is in place. So what are the main arguments in support of Proposition 15 and what would Proposition 15 do? Well, if Proposition 15 passes, by taking away that 2% limitation on commercial and industrial properties, the state would generate an additional $8 to $12.5 billion worth of revenue. Again, yes on Proposition 15 would generate between 8 and 12.5 billion in revenue. And what would that money go towards? Well, 60% of the money would go towards local government. 36% would go to K through 12 schools, and about 4% would go for community colleges. Property taxes are generally one of the largest funding mechanisms for schools, and the proponents of Proposition 15 argue that the Prop 13 limitations were primarily meant to protect homeowners, not to protect businesses. And because the protections apply to businesses as well, it's significantly reducing the funding that we have for schools. So who are those proponents? Well, the California Democratic Party supports Prop 15. So does former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, the California Teachers Association, and the Service Employees International Union. You'll see on the slide that 43 million approximately is being spent in favor of Proposition 15. Next to the California Teachers Association, CTA, you see that it says 11.8 million. So the California Teachers Association specifically has spent 11.8 million in support of Proposition 15 because a portion of the money would go towards schools. SEIU is also spending approximately 7 million in favor of Prop 15. The primary opponents of this are spending about $30 million. They include the California Republican Party, the California Chamber of Commerce, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. I would also note that the California NAACP opposes Prop 15, and the California Black Chamber also oppose Prop 15. So I mentioned the main argument the proponents are using is that these limitations on property taxes were meant for homeowners. They weren't meant for businesses. So by having these limitations apply to businesses, we're limiting the money that schools have. That's the argument in favor of it. The main argument against this, and this is why the NAACP opposes, as well as the Chamber of Commerce and the Black Chamber, they argue that by taking out these limitations on commercial and industrial property, you're going to disproportionately harm business owners of color. Because in the state of California, if you own a property and your property taxes go up, you are allowed to push that increase onto your leasees. So if you own a small business, let's say it's a restaurant or a retail shop, and you're leasing that space for your shop and the property taxes go up, the person that you're leasing from can push that increase onto the store owner. And the NAACP and the Black Chamber have concerns of how that can disproportionately impact business owner of color. And with that, one other quick note, agricultural properties are exempted, so they would still have the protections in place. And property owners that own less than $3 million in property in California, so it's not just a single property being less than 3 million, but if your total holdings are less than 3 million, then you're also exempted from the new property tax requirements. And I will pause and turn it over to Sia to see if we have any questions.
Okay, so we did have 3 questions for Prop 14 after we had closed that out. So we'll get back to that one later. I do have 3 questions for Prop 15. And question number 1 is explain the impact on small businesses.
So there's no way for me to say factually what the impact is going to be. A lot of it is speculatory as to how you think this will impact small businesses. The 2 arguments that we're hearing, and I'll note before getting into the arguments again, this proposition is only 13 pages long. So I'm a big proponent of people going and reading it themselves. I think most people can get through 13 pages in a fairly short amount of time. So when it comes to the impact of small businesses, the 2 arguments that we're hearing are the following. The proponents of Prop 15 would like to say that the 10 largest companies in San Diego are going to see 90% of the increases. So really, yes on Proposition 15 is primarily going to impact big businesses. One example that they like to point to is Disneyland. Disneyland has been paying the same property taxes for decades because they've owned that land for forever. So Disneyland actually pays less in property taxes than a Taco Bell or a hamburger shop right across the street because they've been there for so long. So that's what the proponents say, is this primarily impacts big businesses that have been around for ages and have found loopholes to not have to pay property taxes. The opponents of this argue, like I said, that it'll disproportionately impact small business owners of color because their landlords are going to push any property tax increases onto them, and it could potentially put many of these businesses out of business. So it really depends on the voter as to whose argument you think has more legitimacy. As with most politics, there are some elements of truth to both arguments. There are also some politics to both arguments. So I'll leave it up to the voters as to who you think is being more honest.
Okay. Question number 2, I think you may have answered it, but is how does Prop 15, I think they mean, affect commercial and industrial property taxes?
So their property taxes would most definitely go up. Mm-hmm. So if Prop 15 passes, the vast majority of commercial and industrial properties in California will see their property taxes go up. And we know that, as I mentioned, we know where that money is going to go. We know 60% is going to go to local government, 36% to K through 12, and about 10 to 11% to community colleges. The question then becomes, what is the impact of that tax increase on those business owners? And is it worthwhile given what the money's been would be spent on?
There also is a question about separate bonds for school.
So this is entirely different. So this would have no impact on bonds.
Okay.
So depending on where you live in San Diego County, you may see some bonds on your ballot. This has no impact on bonds whatsoever. That's an entirely different conversation. The bonds themselves are put on the ballot by the school boards. So that's entirely separate from this.
And would that also apply to lottery?
Lottery is also entirely separate from this. So okay. The rules for lotteries and bonds would not change, not be impacted at all by Prop 15. Prop 15 strictly deals with commercial and industrial property. The tie-in to schools is because 40% of the money, 36% to K through 12, 4% to community colleges, is for schools, but the proposition itself doesn't directly address schools aside from where the money generated would go.
Thank you. Would you have a little bit of time to answer the questions for Prop 14 at this time, or would you like to wait for that one?
Oh,
towards
we
the
can go
end?
back to Prop 14. I think it's good
Okay.
time to go back to Prop 14 and let's take those questions.
Okay, that question is there a downstream impact to individual taxes with this proposition?
Directly, no. So there's no direct downstream impact. Indirectly, the state has to pay it back because bonds are borrowing money. So the state's going to have to wait. The state would have to find a way to pay back that bond. And that's where it could potentially impact taxpayers is if the state needed to increase taxes, or for example, if the state needs to cut money being spent in another area in order to pay back this bond, that could impact state services. So it's
Okay.
indirect, but not direct.
Okay. And another question is where and who did the first $3 billion go to?
The $3 billion, there's pretty good consensus that the $3 billion was spent on research. So I don't have a specific list of everybody that received money from the $3 billion, but there is an understanding that it did go to some fairly good research. The main criticism of the original $3 billion was that there might have been a little bit too much that went towards salaries as opposed to research. And that's one of the reasons why the new proposition, Proposition 14, limits it so only 7.5% can be used on salary. So that was a criticism of the $3 billion was too much on salary. So there are now limitations as to only 7.5% of the $5.5 billion can go towards salary.
Okay. And that will conclude the questions for now.
All right, I'll go to 16 now. All right, Proposition 16. So this is one of those tricky ones. So a yes on Proposition 16 is actually a repeal of a previous proposition, Prop 209. So again, voting yes on Prop 16 repeals Prop 209. No on Proposition 16 maintains Proposition 209, which was passed in 1996. So what is Proposition 209? So Proposition 209 is a ban on what most people refer to as affirmative action. So currently in the state of California, we have Prop 209, which bans preferential treatment in state hiring, state contracting, and state school accepting based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or nation of origin. So Proposition 209 is the law right now in the state of California, and it bans preferential hiring, contracting, and school admission based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or nation of origin. Yes on Prop 16 would eliminate that ban. So who are our proponents? The Democratic Party. Assemblywoman Shirley Weber here from San Diego is one of the lead sponsors of this measure. Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Congressman Juan Vargas, and Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher. The proponents are spending about $13 million in favor of Prop 16. The opponents are primarily the Republican Party and former Congressman, current candidate Darrell Issa. They're spending about $1 million opposing Proposition 16. And I'll turn it over to you again, Tasia.
Okay, let's see here. I think the question is, if this is voted on for a yes, when would this go into effect?
It goes into effect in January. Basically,
The new election year?
Correct, the new year. Yep.
Jason?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that was my question. I know we have some people that are just coming in or at different times, and just to reiterate, to please put your questions in the chat room if you weren't here earlier for what needs to be done. And if you have technical problems, once again, just raise your hand. Thank you.
And I'll also just make a quick note as people might be entering questions. I forget if I sent it to you already, Cassandra, but if I haven't, I would be happy to share this PowerPoint. So let me know.
All right. All right.
Any other questions, Tasia?
That is it for now.
All righty. And as I go through this, just to note, 15, 21, and 22 are the most contentious. So we touched about 15. 21 and 22 are the other ones that are fairly contentious, so we'll spend a little bit of extra time on them. All right, Proposition 17. What is Proposition 17? Well, vote on Proposition 17 would restore, and I use restore quite purposely, the voting rights of felons that are on parole. So a yes on Proposition 17 would again give felons who are on parole, that would allow them to vote once again. No means that felons who are on parole remain ineligible to vote. Those that are on probation are eligible, but on parole are still ineligible. An important thing of note, difference between parole versus probation. Parole is an option that's sometimes allowed to people who have been convicted of a crime and they've been behaving themselves well while in jail. So they're allowed to get out of jail. It's like a get out of jail early card because of their good behavior, but they're still being watched. So they're not off the hook yet. They're still being watched and they need to maintain that good behavior. So this would allow those that have been let out early to vote. No means they would remain ineligible. Those that are on probation are eligible to vote. Couple of notes on this one. There are 19 states that currently allow convicted felons on parole to vote. So this would not be unique to California by any means. There are 28 states that have varying rates of disqualifying factors when it comes to felons, as well as when it comes to parolees. So the rules around felons and the rules around parolees varies quite drastically from one state to the next. There are certain states that don't allow any convicted felons to vote ever. There are other states that do at varying degrees. Who would this impact? For approximately 40,000 parolees in California would have their voting rights restored should Proposition 17 pass. So about 40,000 parolees would have their voting rights restored. Who supports it? The California Democratic Party, Senator Kamala Harris, Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher, and Assemblywoman Shirley Weber support it. The California Republican Party opposes this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ticia, sorry.
You were very close. It's Tisha. So for Proposition 17, there are no questions, but I did get one question for Prop 16, if you don't mind answering that one.
No problem.
Okay, so this person asked, what protection or safeguards are in place to prevent unanticipated abuses or favoritism?
None, actually. I would say the only when it comes to Proposition 16, so if Proposition 16 were to pass, essentially the state and the schools would be allowed to create whatever system they deem appropriate. So protections wise, it would be based on whatever system our state create and our school leadership creates. Outside of that, there are no legislative protections built into Proposition 16.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Proposition 18. Proposition 18, 17 and 18 are two of the more straightforward ones. It's kind of, do you want people on parole to be able to vote or not? Proposition 18 is pretty straightforward as well. A yes on Proposition 18 would allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primary as long as they turn 18 on or before the general election. So yes on Proposition 18 allows 17-year-olds to vote in the primary as long as they turn 18 on or before the general election. No on Proposition 18 means you can't vote until you turn 18. Of note, there are 18 states that currently allow 17-year-olds to vote who will be 18 at the time of the general election. So if Proposition 18 were to pass, this would not be unique to California. There are 18 states that already allow this. The main proponents of this are the Democratic Party and our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla. The main opposition is from the Republican Party. The primary argument in favor of this is the sooner that you get people involved in voting and in politics, the more likely that they are to remain involved. So if we are able to get 17-year-olds to start voting, they are more likely to consistently vote as they grow older. The main argument against this is, how much do 17-year-olds actually know? Do we want to trust them with the responsibility of voting? So those are the main arguments here. I would say Proposition 18 is probably the most partisan proposition. Although the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have taken positions on most of these, I would say, based on what you hear and what you'll see, it's not really a black and white as to how Democrats and Republicans are voting. There's a lot of gray area outside of Proposition 18. I think in Proposition 18, Democrats tend to be pretty uniformly in favor. Republicans, on the other hand, tend to be fairly uniformly opposed. And I'll open it up to questions.
At this time, there are no questions in the chat room.
All righty. And as we've done previously, if things come in late, let me know. I have no problem backtracking.
Perfect, thank you.
Proposition 19. Okay. Proposition 19, I think, is the most complicated proposition, and it's one of the smallest tweaks. And this is why becoming informed is important. This is one of the most complicated one, but the tweaks are actually fairly small. So I was talking in Proposition 15, again, about the restrictions on property taxes. So the current law in the state, in California, is your property tax base is set the moment that you purchase a property, and it's limited to 2% increase annually until you sell that property and buy a new property, right? One of the other quirks to that law is that in certain counties in the state of California, if you buy another house, you can transfer your base property tax assessment. So there's concerns. Let's say you're a senior or you had a family and you're looking to downsize. At times, seniors won't downsize because if they buy a new home, their property taxes will shoot up. Same thing with parents. You might not downsize because if you buy a new home, your property taxes will shoot up from the transfer of your base. So what Proposition 19 does is it makes 3 key changes. And this is only for individuals over the age of 55. So first of all, the changes of Proposition 19 would only impact people over the age of 55. So if you were over the age of 55, yes on Proposition 19 would, one, it would allow you to transfer your property tax base anywhere in the state of California. You're no longer restricted to certain counties. So you can transfer your base anywhere in California. That's the first thing. The second thing is you would no longer be restricted to a single transfer over the course of your life. You would now be able to make that transfer 3 times. So instead of being restricted to only certain counties, and instead of being restricted to one-time transfer, you can now go anywhere in the state and you can do it 3 times over the course of your life. And the third big point that I would make on Proposition 19, a yes on Proposition 19 would mean that if somebody inherits a property, right now you're able to maintain the property tax base of your parents or your grandparents. If Proposition 19 passes, you would have to live in the home to keep the low property tax base. If it's a second home or if it's a rental property, then those protections would no longer apply. So inherited properties that are rental homes or vacation homes, they would automatically be assessed upon being inherited. The extra money from that reassessment would go to combating wildfires. However, there's an argument as to whether that would generate any additional money. Who supports this? The Republican Party supports it. The Association of Realtors supports it, California, as well as National Association of Realtors. You'll see 36 million is being spent in favor of this. The 36 million, just about all of it comes from the realtors themselves. The Republican Party has no position on this one. There is no noticeable opposition to this. And with that, I'll open it to questions.
Doesn't appear to have any questions at this time.
All righty. Moving on to Proposition 20. We're making good time, so we might have time to get to the local stuff. So that's good. Proposition 20. So a yes on Proposition 20 would do three things. Yes on Proposition 20 would add certain crimes to the list of what's considered a violent felony. So more crimes would be considered violent felonies. It would increase the number of crimes that can be charged with either a felony or a misdemeanor. So more crimes can be charged as violent felonies. More crimes would have the option, the judge would have the option of charging people with either a misdemeanor or a felony. And the third thing is that more crimes would require the accused to submit to DNA testing. So what are some of those crimes? So the ones that can be charged, I wasn't able to find which crimes would now be included in the list of violent felons. So I don't know which crimes go on that list. But I do know that the crimes that can be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony include firearm theft, vehicle theft, and unlawful use of a credit card. So those three crimes can now be charged as either a felony or a misdemeanor. When it comes to DNA collection, you would now be required to submit to DNA collection if you're convicted of shoplifting, grand theft, drug possession, domestic violence, or prostitution with a minor. So those are the changes. A vote no would not make those changes. Who supports this? The California Republican Party and the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, which has spent approximately $2 million in favor of this. Total, we have about 4.3 million in favor of this. The opponents include the Democratic Party and former Governor Jerry Brown, and the opponents are spending about 5.8 million opposing this. And I will open it up for questions now.
Okay, looks like we have one question and, well, two now. Oh, maybe more. Does this mean that three-strike felony no longer apply?
So three-strike felony was repealed by proposition. I forget what year, but the three-strike felony rule we repealed on a proposition in a previous year.
Okay. The second question is, I don't know if this applies to the proposition. I think you answered the question by saying that you were not able to identify what was considered a violent felony. So
Correct.
I'll move on. Yeah.
Oh, who had the question? Did they need clarification for that?
Which crimes were added?
Okay. And can you inform the rationale for the suggested changes?
The rationale for the suggested changes. So the proponents of this would primarily argue that some of the propositions that we've passed, and one of these might have included three strikes. So this is in 2014 we passed Proposition 47, and in 2016 we passed Proposition 57, which were reductions in a lot of the sentencing guidelines. And one of those might have included three strikes, but we passed Proposition 47 and 57, which amended many of our sentencing guidelines. The proponents would argue that some of those changes were a little bit too liberal. So we're letting potentially dangerous criminals out on the streets when they shouldn't be out on the streets. That's the reason for enhancing violent felonies and giving judges discretion on misdemeanor or felony. The DNA enhancement from Proposition 20, they would say makes it easier to convict repeat offenders. There's two arguments in favor of this. One, DNA collections are very important in order for us to catch repeat offenders. The opponents of this, and this is one of the main reasons why Governor Jerry Brown, and we've seen that when it comes to sentencing, communities of color are disproportionately impacted by enhancing sentencing guidelines. So they would argue that passage of Proposition 20 could potentially disproportionately impact, again, community of colors when it comes to sentencing.
Okay, I think you've answered the last question as well, so that's good.
All right. Proposition 21. And as I mentioned, 21 and 22 are two of the most complicated, two of the hot topics. You'll see advertisements on TV for both of these. So, what is a yes on Proposition 21? So, a yes on Proposition 21 would allow local governments to implement rent control on properties that are over 15 years old. So again, yes on Proposition 21 allows local governments to implement rent control on properties over 15 years old. No on Proposition 21 maintains a current state prohibition on rent control on any properties occupied after February 1st, 1995. Yes means rent control is possible on properties over 15 years old. No means no rent control on anything occupied after 1995. An important distinction, Proposition 21 is not rent control. A yes on Proposition 21 gives local government the option of implementing rent controls, okay? So it gives local government the option. A couple of other notes on Proposition 21. The law in the state of California right now, in addition to banning rent control on properties that were occupied after February 1st, 1995, last year, Governor Gavin Newsom signed a new law that limits rent increases to 5% plus inflation. So rent in state of California is already limited by law to 5% plus inflation. So who supports this? The California Democratic Party, Senator Bernie Sanders, and a group called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation that has spent about $21 million in favor of this. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation is run by a guy by the name of Michael Weinstein. He's a multi-billionaire. I don't know why he cares so much about rent control, but he's a billionaire, so he's got a few bucks to spare. This is obviously an issue that he cares about. Who's against it? $41 million is being spent against it, and it includes the Republican Party, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the California Chamber of Commerce, as well as Essex Property Trust and Equity Residential. You'll see on the slide how much they're spending opposing this. They own a lot of rental properties, so that's why they're opposing this. Is they own a lot of rental properties. You'll see advertisements on Proposition 21 on TV. What's interesting about Proposition 21 is that both the opponents and the proponents are making the same argument. And the question is, who do you trust? So a few notes on that. This is only 7 pages. So again, I would recommend people reading it because it's only 7 pages. And what are both the opponents and proponents arguing? Well, they're both arguing that yes and no are good for seniors. They're both arguing that yes and no are good for working families and for families on limited income. And they're both arguing that yes and no is good for veterans. So why are they both making that same argument? The yes people argue that this is good for seniors, veterans, and working class families because rent keeps increasing and it's pushing people out. So rent increases push families out of apartments because they can no longer afford it, and it forces families to be putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their head. That's what the yes proponents say. The opponents would argue Proposition 21 is dangerous because if you pass rent controls, there's no incentive for a property owner to actually maintain their property. So what property owners will do is Prop 21 passes is they'll just let their properties fall into disrepair until you move yourself out, and then they'll repair it and a new renter moves in at a higher rent. So both of them argue, push you out. I'll let you decide who's more accurate. And with that, I'll put it up to questions.
Okay, as of now, we don't have any questions for Prop 21. However, we have 2 questions for Prop 20 if you're open to answering those.
Is he frozen?
Yeah.
I think. Jason?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Did you lose me? Is my internet acting up?
It's kind of, yeah, there was a little bit of a still pause for a second to see it had asked. So there were some questions from Proposition 20. Is that correct?
Yes, there are two questions for Prop 20. No questions for
Yes, go
21
ahead.
at this time. Okay,
So I am
question,
here. Go ahead.
okay, so question number one is there any data supporting that there are more violent crimes?
I have not seen any data that would suggest an uptick in violent crimes. No, personally,
Okay.
I did not read any data.
And the second question would be, how would this proposition affect the prison population?
Proposition 21. So by law, the state of California has been sued previously. So there are certain restrictions by law to how many prisoners we can have because with overcrowding previously. I don't know that Proposition 21 would have that much of an impact on how many people are in jail, where Proposition 21 would have an impact is on this is my one opinion that I'll give. I think it more so impacts who's in jail and how long they're in jail. But I don't know that it would have that much of an impact as to how many people are in jail, more so who's in jail and how long they're in jail.
Okay. I have two questions for Proposition 21. The first one is the 15 years. Is it tied to ownership or when the property was built?
It's tied to occupancy. So it's when was the property occupied?
Oh, so 15 years occupation, not, okay.
Occupancy. So when did somebody first move in? So essentially, if you built an apartment complex, when was the first person moving in to that complex?
Okay. And does the property include restorative practices?
I don't know what restorative practices are actually.
Who asked the question, if they want to clarify that?
Shylin Garian?
Yeah, that's Shalyn Garan.
Shylin, I'm sorry.
No problem. When they're looking at increasing violent crimes and, that may, include more people being arrested and put in jail, does it include restorative practice, different ways of working with people versus incarceration?
No. So Proposition 21 only deals with incarceration. It does not address any restoration program.
And does Prop 20 affect children under 18?
So it only deals with how long people are going. Not direct. It would impact somebody under the age of 18, depending on what crimes you're charged with. So there are certain crimes where even if you're a minor, you can be an adult. For example, I'll note the desampling of prostitution with a minor. So if you're pimping minors, in general, it doesn't matter how old you are, you can be prosecuted as an adult. Domestic violence is another one. If you're a 17-year-old and you're beating a significant other, you can still be charged as an adult. So I wouldn't say that there's a clear distinction between the ages. It depends on the crime.
Okay. And that is all that I have for now.
All right. Proposition 22. And this one you're going to see a lot of advertisements for because this is the most expensive proposition in the history of California and potentially the history of the United States. So I'll just say that off the bat. This is the most expensive proposition in the history of California, and it may be the most expensive in the history of the United States of America. So, of any state in the nation. So why does this proposition have so much money being spent on it? Well, what does it do? A yes on Proposition 22 would classify app-based drivers as independent contractors. Again, yes on Proposition 22 classifies app-based drivers as independent contractors. So if you drive for Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Proposition 22 passes, you would automatically be considered an independent contractor. That's the main thing. Separately from that, I'll make a quick small note. Proposition 22 would also guarantee app-based drivers an hourly wage slightly above the minimum. It would provide them with a health insurance stipend, and it would provide some medical and disability benefits, but those aren't laid out. So the biggest thing is it makes app-based drivers independent contractors. A small thing underneath that is that it guarantees them an hourly wage. It gives them a health insurance stipend, and it allows for medical and disability benefits, but doesn't lay out what those benefits are. A no on Proposition 22 means the factor test from AB 5 would apply to all employees, including these drivers. So what is the 3-factor test from AB 5? AB 5 says that in order to be an independent contractor, you must be free, 1, free from the hiring company's direction and control. 2, do work outside of the hiring company's normal business. And 3, be engaged in an established trade. And I'll repeat that. So the current law in the state of California is in order for you to be classified as an independent contractor, you must be free from the hiring company's direction and control. You must do work outside of the hiring company's normal business, and you must be engaged in established trade. So, who's in favor of this? Well, as I mentioned, 184 million as of now and increasing is being spent in favor of this. The proponents are the California Republican Party, the California Chamber of Commerce, the California Black Chamber, and the California Hispanic Chamber, as well as the apps Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart, who are spending $47.5, approximately $50 million each in favor of this. The opponents have spent about 10.6 million, most of that coming from labor unions, and include the California Democratic Party, former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher. Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher wrote AB 5, so she opposes these exemptions on the AB 5 requirements. One other thing of note, Proposition 22 would impact approximately, AB 5 impacted about 1 million Californians. So to give you a scope of who might be impacted, less than 1 million people would be impacted should Proposition 22 pass. And I'll turn it over for questions.
Okay, one question is, how are these workers currently classified?
That's a little bit more complicated than it might seem. By law in the state of California, they are considered employees. So by law, they're guaranteed a minimum wage, and Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, all the apps have to pay Social Security for them. They have to pay Medicare for them. They have to contribute unemployment for them. So that's the law. However, the apps are still paying them as independent contractors, and this is being debated in court right now. So there's a court case right now as to what to do. But by law, they're considered employees. The apps are challenging that law and still paying them as independent contractors.
Okay. And question number 2 is, in what other way is AB 5 connected to this proposition?
The main, so, and this is why I make the distinction. This would essentially exempt the app drivers from AB 5. And that's important to note, is that Proposition 22 doesn't repeal AB 5. It exempts app-based drivers from AB 5. So they would be exempted from the law because they're automatically classified as independent contractors.
Does Prop 22 affects people who work under 36 hours?
Proposition 22 does not affect anybody that doesn't drop. It doesn't matter how many hours you work should Proposition 22 pass, because everybody would be an independent contractor. So I'll repeat that again because it's important. If you don't work for an app, if you're not an app driver, it doesn't impact you at all. If you are an app driver and Proposition 22 passes, it doesn't matter how many hours you work for them because you would automatically be an independent contractor. If Proposition 22 fails, and you drive for one of the apps, then the regular laws apply. So then it would get into, are you a part-time worker or are you a full-time worker?
And another question is, how are the current app workers feel about this proposition? Are they for or against this?
So that is a great question. The drivers are split. So you'll see commercials with drivers saying we support Prop 22. You'll also see support commercials with drivers who oppose Prop 22. I don't have data that says how many drivers support it and how many drivers oppose it. That's all I can say is that there are drivers on both sides.
Okay. And I have one question for Prop 21, if you're okay with answering that now. Okay. The person asked, does Prop 21 pertain to single family rentals as opposed to apartments or duplex rentals?
For the most part, Proposition 21 would not apply to single family rentals for the most part, but there are certain exceptions. So it's a little bit complicated, but for the most part, it won't apply to single family rentals.
Okay, for
Actually, sorry, let me amend that.
Okay.
Proposition 21 allows the local governments to create the rules. So a local government could create a rule that applies to single family rentals. I correct myself because traditionally, the conversation of rent controls traditionally hasn't been about single family rentals. However, if Proposition 21 were to pass, again, it doesn't implement a rent control. It gives local government the option to do it. So the city council or the county board of supervisors could choose to apply rent controls to single family units. It just traditionally, that's not been how they get applied. I hope that made sense.
Okay. And I think one last question for Proposition 22 just came in. It said, would the app drivers have to pay their own Social Security taxes? And I assume that if it passes.
Whether Proposition 22 passes or doesn't, the app drivers are going to have to pay.
Okay.
The distinction that I would make is if Prop 22 passes, the app drivers have to pay entirely their Social Security and Medicare, versus if Prop 22 fails, as an employee, your employer pays half of it.
Okay. All right, and that's all for questions.
Perfect. So I'll go to 20. I do want to pause because I think I might have confused a few people on Proposition 21. So I want to go back to that one to be very clear. Proposition 21 is not rent control itself. Proposition 21 gives local governments the option of implementing rent controls. So right now, local governments do not have the option. If the city of San Diego wants to implement a rent control, they're not allowed. By law, the city of San Diego, Lemon Grove, Chula Vista, Oceanside, they are not allowed to implement rent control. Yes, on Proposition 21 gives them that option. And I want to make that clear distinction because on the question of single family dwellings, if Proposition 21 were to pass, you would then want to pay attention to what your city council or your mayor is doing around single family dwellings. So that would be the distinction that I make. So remember, yes on 21 gives the city council and the mayor the option. It doesn't implement any rent controls. So I would say be vigilant if 21 passes and you have thoughts or concerns about it. That would be the ending comment on that. All right. Hopefully that cleared it up. Sorry about, again, some of these get confused. That's why I want to make sure we're clear. So Proposition 23. Yes on Proposition 23. Would more new changes on dialysis clinics? Yes on Proposition. Can you guys still hear me? I got to pop up to my internet.
Yeah, there was a pause, and I think, go ahead, Tasia. There was a question still for 22.
Okay, so 22, if it passes, will the apps receive a 1099?
If Prop Proposition 22 passes, all drivers will be 1099. Yes.
Thank you.
If Proposition 22 passes, all drivers are 1099.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Proposition 23. So yes on Proposition 23 would add 4 new requirements for dialysis clinics. So yes on Prop 23 would establish the following 4 requirements. 1, dialysis clinics would be required to have an on-site physician. 1, dialysis clinics are required to have an on-site physician. Number 2, dialysis clinics would be required to report new data on patient infections tied to dialysis. So they would be required to track and report new data on infections tied to dialysis. Number 3, dialysis clinics would need permission to close from the Department of Health. So dialysis clinics wouldn't be allowed to close without state Department of Health permission. And number 4, dialysis clinics would not be allowed to discriminate based on payment. So they cannot treat patients differently if you're on Medicare versus Kaiser versus Blue Cross Blue Shield, PPO. They would have to treat all patients the same. So on physician, data reporting for infections, consent to close, and no discrimination based on source of payments. The new vote would mean those new requirements don't apply to dialysis clinics. So who supports this? The Democratic Party supports it, and the Service Employee International Union supports it. They've spent about 5.5 million out of the 6.1 million. Who opposes it? Well, 93 million has been spent so far opposing this. The Republican Party opposes it. DaVita, which is a major dialysis clinic owner, is spending 60 million opposing this. Fresenius also owns dialysis clinics. They're spending 26 million against this. Renal Care spending 6.9 million against it, and the California Medical Association opposes this as well. The main arguments with Prop 23, the proponents of Proposition 23 would tell you that dialysis patients right now receive substandard care. The employees are not trained properly. It's quite dangerous. Mistakes happen all the time. So we need these new requirements, 1, to protect patients, and 2, to ensure that patients have proper care regardless of what kind of insurance they have. So that's the proponents say this is to protect patients and to guarantee quality care across the board. The opponents of it say, 1, these new requirements are entirely unnecessary, and 2, patients are already receiving pretty good care. A couple of other things of note. In 2018, California voters rejected a similar proposition that would have limited the profits of dialysis clinics. So in 2018, voters rejected a proposition that limited the profits of dialysis clinics. There are approximately 600 dialysis clinics in the state of California right now that service 80,000 patients a month. So there are about 600 clinics right now that service 80,000 patients a month. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tisha. Did I know?
Tisha. Okay.
I'm gonna get it next time, Tisha.
No worries. So one of the questions is, what is the financial impact of these dialysis centers having with the physician on site?
So the financial impact is that the dialysis clinics would have to pay the physician to be on site. So it's a significant cost to the dialysis clinics to have an on-site physician there. One thing that I wouldn't using this because they feel that would be unnecessary to have an on-site physician. So the proponents say we need an on-site physician because the employees are terrible and they're hurting patients. So the physician is needed in case something really bad happens to protect the patient. The California Medical Association would say that's unnecessary, but it would be a significant cost to pay a doctor to be there all day.
Yeah. Let's see here. What is the benefits of this proposition for proponents? I think you answered that question.
The benefits primarily are around quality of care. So the proponents would largely say that these changes are needed to protect the patients. So everything that they propose here is to protect patients.
Are the Nurse Association in favor or against this proposition?
I did not find them listed under the major proponents or opponents. So they might have a position, but I did not see them listed under the major organizations.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. 24. 24 is another one of these that's really, really, really complicated. So I'll try my best to simplify it. So, Proposition 24. Yes on Proposition 24 would expand California consumer privacy laws to include 4 new items. So just like we had 4 new things in Proposition 23, there would be 4 new consumer data protections in place with Prop 24. So a yes on Prop 24 would mean customers are allowed to direct businesses not to share their information. So that's number 1. Customers are allowed to direct businesses not to share their information. Number 2, businesses are required to provide customers an opt-out option. So you can opt out of your information being shared. Number 3, it removes the window for businesses to fix any problems. They would be fined. They could be fined immediately if they're sharing. And number 4 is it creates a California Privacy Protection Agency. So I'll run through those again. Yes on 24 means 1, consumers can tell businesses not to share their information. 2, businesses are required to give consumers an opt-out option. Number 3, it removes the window allowing businesses to fix violations before they get fined. And number 4, it establishes a California Privacy Protection Agency. No on Prop 24 would not do those 4 things. So who supports this? The supporters are spending about $5.5 million, and former Democratic presidential Andrew Yang is the big proponent of this. Who opposes it? The ACLU of California and CARE, which is the Center on American Islamic Relations, oppose this. There are civil rights concerns about privacy laws and data collection. One other thing of note is if Prop 24 passes, it would require Sacramento to allocate $10 million to the California Protection Agency. So this would require Sacramento to give $10 million to implementing these protections. The main arguments, yes and no. The yes people say individuals should have more control over their personal information. You should decide whether the businesses collect this information and how they share it. So the proponents say this is to protect individuals, so you control your information. The opponents of this say, why are social media companies exempted? And that's an important note. Social media companies are exempted from the new requirements. So Proposition 24 would apply to Google, Yahoo, Microsoft. It would not apply to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. The opponents of this are very much concerned that it doesn't apply to social media companies. The opponents argue social media companies are the worst offenders when it comes to collecting personal information and selling that information. So they would be the first ones that we would want to apply more protections to, not the last ones. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tisha.
So the cost is $10 million. Where would that come from?
That would be up to Sacramento. So we are telling Sacramento they need to still fund somewhat depressing side to it, since I'm an econ major. About 80 to 90% of the budget of the state of California, we've told them what they have to spend it on. So our elected officials only really decide anywhere from 10 to 20% of where our money goes. This would be another one of those instances. We're telling our elected officials that they have to spend $10 million on this. They would have to figure out where the 10 million comes from.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
We don't tell them where to find. California voters are really good at telling Sacramento how much to spend on things. We're not as good at telling them where to find the money.
Mm-hmm.
Tasia, Jason,
Yes.
I have one question from Prop 23. I sent it to you privately, Tasia. Should have done.
Oh, I didn't get it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't get it.
My question, Jason, is those who are on dialysis, they're already in a critical state. If this does not pass, how will this impact their health? Obviously, they're in a critical state as it is. So if it doesn't pass,
If it doesn't pass, then it would basically be status quo. So if Proposition 23 fails, it maintains status quo with the dialysis clinics.
so it would be no type of improvement or anything.
No, Proposition 23 would not, there would be no requirement. I would say if 23 fails, there's no required changes of the dialysis clinics. The dialysis clinics could choose to make changes, but there would be no required changes if 23 fails.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Anything else on 24 or any of the others? And then I'll move on to 25, which is our last state one.
Nope,
All right.
that is it.
25, this is our last state one. So Proposition 25. This is another quirky one. So yes on Proposition 25 is upholding the law, which is SB 10. So we're voting whether to uphold SB 10, which was the law passed by Sacramento. No on Proposition 25 repeals SB 10. So we have yes to uphold it, no to repeal it. So what is SB 10? SB 10 repealed cash bail and replaced it with a new risk assessment system. So the essence of what you're voting on in Prop 25 is yes on Prop 25 would replace cash bail with a risk assessment system. No on Prop 25 would maintain cash bail. So who supports this? The California Democratic Party supports it. Governor Gavin Newsom, Assemblymember Todd Gloria, and Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher. Who opposes it? The Republican Party, the California Black Chamber of Commerce, the California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. The proponents have spent approximately $8.3 million in favor of this. The opponents have spent about $9 million opposing this. So, what are the main arguments? The primary argument in favor of this is twofold. One, cash bail, first of all, cash bail has a disproportionate impact on working families because you can be put in jail, innocent or guilty doesn't matter. If you can't afford to pay your bail, you're stuck in jail. So you can lose your job, you can have trouble with your family, and you're not even guilty. You can ultimately be innocent and you've lost your job, had family problems because you simply couldn't afford to post bail. So that's the first argument of the proponents, is that bail isn't based on guilty or innocent. And if you can't afford bail, you can then be innocent and you've already had these problems. The second argument is that if we look at who's being put in jail, communities of color are disproportionately put in jail. So people that are innocent can be impacted by bail, and ultimately communities of color who disproportionately end up in jail will ultimately be staying in jail. That's what the proponents say. The opponents of this, and it's one of the reasons why the Hispanic Chamber opposes this and the Black Chamber oppose this, is if we switch from a cash bail system to the risk assessment system, what guarantee do we have that the risk assessment system isn't going to assess individuals of color differently than those that are white? So there's still a computer program that people are making, and there's still judges that are making the decisions using this risk assessment system. Just because we eliminate cash bail doesn't mean that the risk assessment system is going to be any better for communities of color, because there's still a computer program, and we've seen that even computer programs can disproportionately impact communities of color. We see that in buying and selling properties. We see that in other valuations, that communities of color can be disproportionately impacted. So there's no guarantee with passage of Prop 25 that we're going to resolve the issues impacting communities of color. And with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
One of the main questions is, what is the risk assessment system? How does it work?
We don't know. So the SB 10 was kind of put on hold pending Proposition 25. So we don't know what the risk assessment will be. The only thing that we know is that there would be a risk assessment system created, and then a judge would be given a score. And based on that score, that judge would decide whether the person remains in jail or is allowed to get out of jail pending trial. So the only thing that we know is that this risk assessment system would be created, a score would be given to the judges, and then the judges would use that score to decide whether people remain in jail or whether they're allowed out pending trial.
And that was the only question for Proposition 25.
All righty. So with that, we're making great time.
There was
Move
one other
on to
question. There was one other question for,
Oh, go
More
ahead.
question?
I wanted to know if if Proposition 25 does fail, that means then cash bail is still the law of the land?
Correct. If Proposition 25 fails, SB 10 would be repealed and cash bail would remain the law of the land. All righty. So with that, so those are all the statewide propositions. So 14 to 25, everybody in California is voting. Now I'll just go through really quickly and then we can kind of open the floor to the San Diego County measures. So great news, there's none of them. So there is nothing that everybody in San Diego County is voting on. So that's an easy one. Nobody in San Diego County, there are no measures that everybody in county is voting on. Now, City of San Diego. In the City of San Diego, there are three things that we're going to be voting on, and they're a little bit out of order. But of note, in the City of San Diego, you are voting on A, B, and E as an elephant. A, B, and E as an elephant. I'll get into those momentarily. C and D, the reason that they're out of order, C and D apply to San Diego Unified School District. So C and D are for San Diego Unified School District, but not all people that live in the City of San Diego live in the school district. So A, B, and E are City of San Diego. So what are A, B, and E? Well, Measure A, and as I said, measure, so propositions are the state, measure is local. A, it's a letter, not a number, it's local. So Measure A, yes on Measure A would allow the city to issue $900 million in bonds to finance affordable housing. So a yes allows the city to issue $900 million in bonds to finance affordable housing. No means that the city can't issue those bonds. Couple of things of note. How do the bonds work? Well, the bonds are generally used on a matching basis. So if I want to build affordable housing, I, as the investor, as the developer, I have $20 million, but I need $40 million. So I go to the state and I go to the city and ask the city to match my money. So in general, this $900 million gets leveraged as matching fund for developers and people that want to build affordable housing. So that's the first thing. The other thing to note is that the $900 million would specifically be focused on veterans, on housing for veterans, seniored, disabled, homeless, and youth. So the $900 million would focus on veterans, seniors, disabled, homeless, and youth. Another thing of note would be that the housing units that take funding from this bond are required to provide wraparound services. So they would be required to offer on-site mental health assistance, substance abuse assistance, job counseling. It's not just a roof over your head, but also all the services that the homeless might need, or a veteran might need, a senior might need. So it needs to incorporate all those services to apply for this funding. Another thing, if we're borrowing money, we got to pay it back. So in order to pay back the $900 million, all property owners in the city of California would be assessed an assessment of anywhere from $3 to $21 per 100,000 that your property is worth. So if you're a homeowner and your home is worth $500,000, you would pay annually anywhere from $15 to $100 more in order to pay back these bonds. Who supports it? Democratic Party supports it. Republican Party supports it. Democratic Party thinks we need to provide additional affordable housing. Republican Party is concerned about the city taking on debt. It's general fiscal concerns that you'll see within the Republican Party. And with that, I'll open it to questions.
At this time, there are no questions in the chat room.
All right. Measure B. So Measure B, again, for the city of San Diego. So a yes on Measure B. And Measure B specifically is tied to the San Diego Police Department. So Measure B is tied to concerns, misconduct, violations within the San Diego Police Department. So a yes on Measure B would dissolve the current Community Review Board. So it would dissolve the current Community Review Board and establish an independent review commission. So yes dissolves the Community Review Board and establishes an independent commission. No would maintain the Community Review Board. So what are the main differences between the Community Review Board that we have now and the independent commission that would be established? The main distinctions are the following. One, the Community Review Board right now is appointed by the mayor. The Independent Review Commission would be appointed by the city council. So the mayor does the board, the city council does the commission. Another key distinction is that the commission would have the following authority. The commission would have subpoena power, independent legal counsel, and it would be allowed to, it would have subpoena power and independent legal counsel that it could use to investigate misconduct and complaints against officers, as well as make recommendations about officer discipline and policies within the police department. So the commission would have independent legal counsel and subpoena power, which it could use to investigate police misconduct and complaints, and it can also make recommendations on discipline and compliance. The review board makes recommendations. They do not have legal authority, so they cannot issue subpoenas and they do not have outside counsel. The Democratic Party supports Measure B. The Republican Party has taken no position on Measure B. And from what I've seen, it looks like the union that represents most police officers has no position on this either. And I'll open it up to questions.
At this time, there are no questions in the chat room.
All righty, moving right along. Measure E. This one is a very specific one. Measure E, a yes on Measure E removes the 30-foot height limit on developments in the Midway Pacific Highway community area. So just to be blunt, Measure E is all about the sports arena. So yes on Measure E would remove a 30-foot height limit on redevelopments of the sports arena. No on Measure E maintains a 30-foot height limit on any redevelopment of the property where the sports arena is. Both Democrats and Republicans support Measure E. That tells you a lot in and of itself. The proponents of Measure E would argue we need to remove the height limit. This height limit was passed years ago by voters in the city of San Diego. The 30-foot height limit applies to anything west of I-5, since voters were concerned about blocking beach and ocean views. But there's not a lot of people that live next to the sports arena that have a nice beach or ocean view. So they feel like the height limit being applied to the Midway Pacific area is unnecessary. The opponents of Measure E largely have environmental and affordable housing concerns. They don't like the idea of lifting the height limit without putting in place requirements for affordable housing or requirements for what that development might encompass. So those are the primary arguments around Measure E. And I'll open it up to any questions.
At this time, there are no questions for Measure E, but a question did come in from Measure B.
All righty. What's that?
Will the police department have to adhere to what the commission findings are?
To some extent, yes. It's a little bit gray because it depends on passage of the commission, and the city council has to work out some of the details. But yes, the for the most part, the commission is going to have authority where they can require certain changes to be made of the police department practices.
Okay, and that appears to be the last question.
All righty, so as I mentioned, just a few quick notes. There are two San Diego Unified measures, Measure C and Measure D. Of note, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both support Measure C, and they both support Measure D. What does Measure C do? Measure C establishes districts for the board to vote on. So currently, San Diego Unified School Board members are elected by everybody that lives in San Diego Unified. Yes on Measure C means it would be split up into districts. Although the board is currently split up into districts, the board members are voted on by everybody. So this would mean that the board is voted on based on those that live in their district. That's Measure C. It's district voting for the school board. Measure D, and then I'll just take the questions together if there are any. Measure D, this one is interesting. It establishes a process to remove board members and to fill those vacancies. There have been some concerns about some of the current board members, and many in San Diego were surprised to find out that there was no way to kick a board member off if they committed a grievous violation. So you had to wait till the next election in order to kick that board member off. Right now there's no way to kick somebody off the San Diego Unified School Board. Measure D would create a system by which we can kick board members off if they are conducting themselves in an improper manner, and it would create a way to fill that vacancy. So with that, I'll open it to anything on C or D, if there are.
There's no questions on C or D, but there is one question on Measure E.
All right, so I'm sorry, I went in the wrong direction. Measure E, go ahead, I'll just let you go ahead with that one.
They wanted to know what other communities are affected by Measure E, intentionally or unintentionally.
None. Measure E specifically applies to the Midway Pacific Highway Community Plan. So that is
and that's the sports arena property?
It's not for any property specific. So there are about 4 different proposals. So on Measure E, there's about 4 different proposals that have been submitted to the San Diego City Council by developers on what they would like to do with the San Diego Sports Arena property and surrounding area. Measure E would allow the city to consider proposals that include buildings above 30 feet. If Measure E fails, the city could only consider proposals with that 30-foot limit. But it doesn't impact anywhere else in the city. It's only for that area. One other quick note, and then I'll stop sharing so everybody can see each other. These are some of the other measures depending on where you might live, since I assume there are people in here from different areas. So in Carlsbad, you do have a Measure G, Encinitas, Imperial Beach. Depending on where you live, you may see some of these others. I would just encourage you to do your own research. As I stated previously, some of these measures are only a couple pages long. It's really not that difficult to read them, not that difficult to do your research. So please do your research, do your reading. And with that, hopefully the information that I provided is helpful. I will stop sharing so everybody can see each other. And then I'm happy to take any questions on propositions, measures, or any general questions about the election overall.
Are there any questions?
None on the chat. Everyone is thanking Jason for doing such a wonderful
yes,
job.
thank
Thank you, Jason. We appreciate you being here today, helping us out.
Thank you. I would just like to say on behalf of the graduate chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, San Diego chapter, thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa, for asking those questions, and also for the participants. Wow. I mean, dynamic questions. I just really like to say that. We also have our president of Alpha Kappa Alpha San Diego chapter on this in the meeting, and I would like to introduce her, Deborah Davis Gillespie.
Hi, Cassandra. And this has truly been an informative and educational proposition forum. Jason, the insight and information you shared has certainly assisted me, and I'm sure that it has assisted others in making knowledgeable, educated decisions as they cast their vote. So thank you so much to you. We thank you for your time and energy and assistance. So job well done.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank our moderator, Cassandra Clady, who also is the chairman of the Connection Committee, the committee responsible for this forum, as well as Tisha Gaston for fielding all those questions. That can be tricky, and you all did it just great. So thank you for doing that. And thank you to all of our participants. It's so good to have you here with us. It is our goal and desire to inform and educate and encourage people to vote. So please go vote, and just thank you for joining us. And if there's any committee members that are here, I'd like you to just wave the Connection Committee so we can applaud you, tell you job well done in putting this together. So thank you so much, everyone. And back to you, Cassandra.
And so, Cassandra, if I can add just one quick note before everybody starts leaving. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's truly been an honor. I think it's, as I said, it's very important for voters to be educated, and hopefully you've learned something from the presentation today. As a side note, and I will be sharing the PowerPoint. I will send that over to Cassandra so she can share it with everybody else. And very, very important, I'm posting in the chat right now. If you haven't yet, please go to 2020census.gov. You must complete your census before the end of this month. And the response rate right now in San Diego is around the 70s. There are billions and billions of dollars of federal government money at stake that depends on us answering the census. So if you haven't, go fill it out. And if you've already done it, tell your friends, tell your families, tell your neighbors. It is very, very important for us to complete the census to ensure San Diego gets its fair share of resources to help us out with what we need. So thanks again for having me. It's really been a pleasure. And I'll turn it over to you, Cassandra.
Well, I think everything has been said. Again, I just wanted to thank everyone for chiming in. We advertise it on social media as far as Instagram, Facebook, email, texting, all of that. And I just am thankful for all those who have participated. Again, do not forget to vote. We are in a critical election. And if there's no further questions, this concludes the Proposition 101 forum.